Hello, interns. As we look at the book of Jonah over the course of this semester, one of the things that's always a helpful exercise to do when approaching any of the book of the Bible is to just locate ourselves in the sense of the broader story and the sense of the canon, what has happened before, what is happening after, pull on the threads, right? So I'm going to try to walk back all the way from the beginning because I think that is relevant to kind of positioning ourselves into this particular narrative and what is God up to and what does this contribute to our view of God and our view of His way of working with humanity. So let's go back to the garden. All right. So garden. Okay. Garden. And we'll do. I'll go ahead and kind of include over here what book of the Bible we're in as you want to keep along. So we're going to be in Genesis for now. In the garden, God and humanity were in fellowship, right? Adam and Eve, and things were as God intended them to be. They had God's blessing, and they were to fill the world and to help co-cultivate it with God. So, as we know, things kind of go south from there, not too soon after, it seems, right? We have what we might call sin, moral autonomy, man and woman deciding for themselves what is good rather than trusting what God deems is good. And this threatens God's blessing, God's relationship with mankind. So, not far after we're introduced to this, we're introduced to some good news. We could go with Gen chapter 3. If you look at this, God is going to through Eve, a descendant will come that will defeat the enemy. So we're already kind of hoping that this we're waiting for a person, a figure, a messianic hope. What is God doing? So we have we're looking for the figure that's coming that would save us. That's our hope. So up to this point, and then even beyond this, if we go Genesis 1 through 11, really, all the way through chapter 11, there's this focus on global humanity, right? It's Adam and Eve, it's Cain and Abel, and then it's Noah, and then it's the Tower of Babel. And all along, God is concerned with all of humanity. So it may come as a bit of a shock when we get to Genesis chapter 12, when the focus narrows all the way down to one individual, Abraham. So this hope of a figure, a descendant of Eve, was actually narrowed greatly by God's promise to Abraham. And what is the nature of that promise? Well, he says to Abraham that he would bless the world through him, that he would make him into a great nation, and that nation would bless the world. It would be the world would be blessed through. So that's interesting preposition, isn't it? So to be blessed through something, this is what we could call a conduit people. You guys are familiar with conduit? Conduit is kind of like a pipe, if you think about it. There's a little electrical stripping on the wall. Electrical conduit is something that carries something somewhere else. So this blessing, guys, that God gave the world, is it gone? Is it lost? Well, we find out that it will come into the world through Abraham and his descendants. So, Abraham, let's go ahead and hit some geography, shall we? So Abraham lives in, what's called the Levant. It's the ancient Near East, whatever you want to call it. You guys are. This is the Mediterranean Sea, right? This is the Sinai Peninsula. We'll go ahead and draw the Jordan. And I believe the Sea of Galilee is somewhere up here, the Dead Sea. Okay, and then we have the Nile Delta, and down here's Egypt, right? All right. Draw some sea over here too. Okay. Abraham was over here in the land of Ur, not too far from ancient Babylonia, and God said, "Hey, I want you to go to a land I will show you." And so part of this blessing that God intends to carry through Abraham into the world and his global concern, not just concern for Abraham, but on behalf of the whole world, his plan is going to work through one person, and that one person would inherit this land. So he's invited to live there as a foreigner. He actually doesn't fully inherit the land. A lot of God's promises to Abraham are not fulfilled within Abraham's lifetime, but come to fulfillment at a later date, as we'll see in a moment. So in Genesis chapter 15, we see God had this weird scene where Abraham's invited to count the stars, and they have a covenant ceremony, and Abraham is put to sleep, and God says some interesting things about what would happen to Abraham's descendants, including slavery in Egypt, oppressed for 400 years, and then redemption, and then that they would inherit the land of, and he lists a lot of places that we know are basically the area of Canaan, right, which is what I just circled. This is the promised land. So already we know that God's plan to have blessing come to the whole world would happen through this one man and the nation that he spawns, and that it would take shape in this particular land. So we're going to be attentive to that. We're just going to flash forward here all the way down to Exodus. And if we look at the book of Exodus, we meet this figure kind of striking this hopes for Genesis chapter 3, this messianic hope. Somebody's coming to defeat the enemy. Is it Moses? Well, we're introduced to Moses in Egypt, and he leads people from Egypt. And God's activity, you guys are aware of the story of Exodus. Amazing. And he leads them, and they actually do wander around the desert for a generation before Moses dies. And in the plain of Moab, they renew. So in the book of Exodus, we can look at Exodus chapter 19. And we can look at the book of Deuteronomy. And then we can look at Deuteronomy chapter 4. And I'll explain this connection. But basically, at this stage, they are given a covenant, right? A contract. Here's how we're going to live life. What God would do to bring blessing into the world was give his people a certain way to live, which included a tent filled with imagery of the garden, that conveyed that God is still with his people and that he is available. In Exodus chapter 19, if you will do these things for me, you'll be for me a treasured possession, a kingdom of priests. What do priests do? Priests represent a living God. So this priestly nation would inherit this piece of property, and they would represent God on the global stage. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 4. That the world would scratch their heads and say, their God is close to them. Their laws are different. There's something unique about this people group. What is it? What is it? Oh, it's God, the living God, and his blessing. And he's giving them a restored way of life, a renewed humanity within the constructs of this covenant and its way of life. So, this is what is at stake. Is it just related to Israel? No, it's related to global humanity and God's desire to bless it. So, as the narrative progresses, we could go through the book of Joshua, where they actually take over the land. We could go through the book of Judges, where they miserably fail. We could go through the book of Samuel, the 2 books of Samuel, and we could get into the Kings. And basically, we're going to flash forward through a bunch of history. In the book of Samuel, we're introduced to a king figure, predominantly, after Saul, David. And David would realize much of what God said to Moses, much of what God said to Abraham before that, is realized during David's reign. And all of the land that God had said he was going to give them, and there's great hopes about how Israel would actually live out this covenant way of life and on the global stage provide a place for blessing. Why did God fixate on this piece of property? I'm not exactly sure. But some of the theories include the fact that this is, there's no way around this if you're an ancient global culture. Assyria's up over here, Babylon's up over here, you've got Greece, later Rome, you have Egypt. this is a place you can't help but cross through. And what God intended people to encounter was a people that were loving to the foreigners, that were equitable, that were just, that didn't have a cult image, they didn't worship an idol. They cared for one another, and they lived out the blessing, the covenant blessing, the love, a culture of love. That's what, if Jesus summarized what the law and the prophets say, he said, love God and love others, right? So if we were going to summarize what this covenant was about, that's what it was about. Would they live it out? Would they do it? Well, as you read the book of Judges, you're like, oh, really sad. And then you get a little optimistic about what God's doing in David, and you get a little sad again. And it goes all the way down. Eventually the kingdom split. God actually, he used a prophet to actually order the split. So it wasn't like it was just people's idea. But what happens is that the north does the same mistake Adam and Eve did, and they decide good and evil for themselves, and they decide to worship a cult idol and abandon the covenant way of life that God gave them. So this is the scenario in which we find Jonah, that what Israel is doing in the north, they're not remembering this. They're not living it out. And what is at stake? Not just Israel and their faith and their relationship with God, but the whole world. And we see this interesting concern, these prophets like Jonah that rub elbows with other nations. And you're like, well, what authority does Yahweh of Israel have over Assyria and the city of Nineveh? It seems that God is above any other god in the ancient Near East, and markedly different than other ancient literature. He has a claim on all of humanity, and he intends to bless all of it through this covenant people. So what is Jonah supposed to represent? Not just Israel's interests, not just their self-concern, not just his own concerns, but the concern and the compassion and the heart of God for all of humanity. That is what is at stake in the book of Jonah in the biblical narrative.